The official U.S. Army history compresses the final cave battle on Okinawa into a single line. In 5 days, armored flamethrowers of the 713th Armored Flamethrower Battalion poured more than 37,000 gallons of burning fuel into the Japanese positions. 5 days, June 13 through June 17, 1945. That number is shocking, but the number is not the real story. The real story is why an army with total control of the sea, the sky, and the largest concentration of firepower in the Pacific still needed modified Sherman tanks to reach men hiding behind openings barely 2 feet wide. By June, American battleships had shelled southern Okinawa for weeks. Army artillery had hammered the ridges. Aircraft had bombed and strafed them. Ordinary tanks had fired high explosive directly into the rock. The defenders survived because they were not standing on the ridge, they were inside it. The Yaeju-Dake escarpment and the ground around Hill 95 formed part of the last organized barrier protecting the headquarters of Japan's 32nd Army. The terrain was coral and limestone twisted into ridges, cross ridges, ravines, shelves, and cliffs. It looked less like a clean military position than a broken skeleton pushed out of the earth. But beneath that broken surface was a defense system. Japanese engineers and infantry had cut firing chambers into the reverse slopes, the sides American observers could not see. Cave mouths were small, camouflaged, and often protected by other caves. A team moving toward one opening could be caught by fire from another opening behind it or off to the side. Tunnels linked positions together. Crews could fire, disappear underground, and emerge somewhere else. Secondary exits meant that surrounding a cave did not necessarily trap the men inside it. Okinawan tombs became part of the network. Built into hillsides from concrete and stone, they could be reinforced, concealed, and turned into ready-made fighting positions. The result was a fortress with almost no visible walls. American artillery observers could see the crest. They could see the forward slope. What they could not see was the reverse face where the weapons were placed. Shells could chew apart the exposed rock while the defenders waited behind it. Unless a round entered a cave mouth directly, the men underground could endure the barrage and return to their guns when it lifted. This was not an accident of terrain. It was the central idea behind Lieutenant General Mitsuru Ushijima's defense of Okinawa. Rather than sacrifice the 32nd Army in a battle on the beaches, Ushijima allowed the Americans to land on April 1 with little opposition. The real defense began inland, where reverse slopes, tunnels, tombs, and caves could reduce the value of naval gunfire and air power. Colonel Hiromichi Yahara, Ushijima's operations officer, wanted a war of attrition and depth. General Isamu Cho, the chief of staff, pushed for the more traditional mass counterattack. After a major Japanese attack failed in early May, the army returned to Yahara's method. Stay underground. Trade space for time. Make the Americans pay for every ridge. It worked. The 10th Army crossed the landing beaches quickly, then spent weeks grinding against the Shuri defenses. Sugarloaf, Half Moon, Chocolate Drop Kakazu, and dozens of lesser positions became names for the same problem. Firepower could suppress the surface, but it could not reliably destroy what was hidden inside the coral. When Shuri finally fell at the end of May, the 32nd Army was not annihilated. Much of it withdrew south and built another line across the Kaiyan Peninsula. The Americans had broken the position. They had not broken the system. And the last version of that system was waiting at Yaeju-Dake, Yaeju-Dake, Kunishi Ridge, Hill 95, and the ground leading toward Ushijima's headquarters in Hill 89. The weapon that could enter that system had started as a desperate engineering answer in Hawaii. Infantry flamethrowers already existed. They had been used against caves since the campaign began. The problem was not whether flame worked. The problem was getting the operator close enough to use it. A man-portable flamethrower weighed roughly 70 pounds when loaded. Its effective reach was measured in a few dozen yards. The operator had to cross open coral, climb toward a tiny firing slit, and enter the range of rifles, machine guns, mortars, and grenades while carrying a fuel tank on his back. Japanese troops learned to identify flamethrower teams and shoot them first. The weapon could kill a cave. The man carrying it often could not reach the cave. So Navy Seabees and Army Chemical Warfare Service personnel put the projector inside a Sherman. The conversion was radical. They removed the 75mm cannon from the turret. The flamethrower tube was installed so that, from a distance, the tank still looked like an ordinary gun-armed M4. The turret basket and ammunition space were sacrificed to carry roughly 290 gallons of thickened fuel. The tank gave up the weapon that defined it. In exchange, it gained the ability to carry more than 4 times the fuel of a man-portable team, approach under armor, and project burning gel across a combat range, commonly measured between about 40 and 80 yards, sometimes farther under ideal pressure. The fuel was mostly gasoline mixed with napalm powder. The thickener changed everything. Thin gasoline broke apart in flight and burned away quickly. The gel held together, traveled farther, adhered to rock and timber, and continued burning after it struck. Compressed carbon dioxide forced the mixture through the system. An atomizer broke it into a spray. An electric igniter lit it at the muzzle. When it worked, the result was not a flash. It was a stream of burning gel that clung to the entrance and carried heat, smoke, and combustion gases into the confined passage behind it. The official designation was cumbersome, POACWSH-1. To the crews and the infantry it was simply the flame tank. From the front it still looked like a Sherman. That resemblance created a second advantage no armor designer could measure on a drawing board.
Deception.
A Japanese anti-tank crew, watching several Shermans approach, could not always tell which one carried high explosive and which one carried nearly 300 gallons of napalm. The answer became obvious only when the first burst left the barrel. Then every gun that could bear turned toward it, because the tank's strengths did not erase its weaknesses. Its armor was still Sherman armor. Its sides and rear remained vulnerable to the Japanese 47mm anti-tank gun at close range. Mines could stop it on the approach. Infantry could use smoke, crawl close, and attack with satchel charges, and the flame tank had to enter that danger zone before it could fire. A gun tank could engage from hundreds of yards away. A flame tank had to close until the cave mouth was no longer a mark on a hillside but a target. The fuel system introduced its own hazards. Pressure loss shortened the stream. Ignition failure could spray unburned gel across the target, exposing the tank's identity without neutralizing the position. A leak inside the hull could coat the crew compartment with the same fuel the projector was meant to throw. Then there was the simplest weakness of all. A flame tank without fuel had no cannon. A full load could provide only about a minute of continuous discharge, so crews rarely held the trigger down. They fired short bursts, often close to 1 second each, walking the stream across a cluster of openings. Those bursts stretched a load into dozens of separate attacks. But when the tanks ran dry, they had to leave. Refueling could take at least 90 minutes. Repressurizing the carbon dioxide system added more time. The vehicle had to withdraw from the line, reach the chemical warfare fuel point, take on hundreds of gallons, restore pressure, and return through the same mud and shell-cut roads. The weapon was not only a tank. It was a supply chain. If the fuel trucks stopped, if the pressure bottles failed, if the route disappeared under rain, the most feared Sherman on the island became an armored vehicle with no main gun. The 713th Armored Flamethrower Battalion came ashore on April 7 with more than 50 flame tanks ready for the campaign. Their first major trial came on April 19 near Kakazu Ridge. That day revealed both the weapon's promise and its price. Japanese troops immediately concentrated on the flame tanks when they recognized them. Anti-tank guns struck from hidden positions. Mines and close assault teams attacked along the routes. 4 armored flamethrowers were among the 22 American tanks lost around Kakazu that day. The disaster was not proof that flame had failed. It was proof that armor without infantry could still be separated, isolated, and destroyed. The Americans adapted. Flame tanks began working as part of an increasingly disciplined combined arms team. Gun tanks suppressed visible weapons. Artillery and mortars forced defenders to keep their heads down. Infantry protected the vehicles from close assault. Demolition teams followed to seal entrances and destroy positions that flame had neutralized. General Simon Bolivar Buckner gave the method a name. Blowtorch and corkscrew. The blowtorch was flame, the corkscrew was explosives. But neither worked without infantry close enough to finish the position, and neither survived long without the rest of the team. Through April and May, the method improved one ridge at a time. The Japanese improved too. They placed anti-tank guns where the Shermans had to turn and expose their flanks. They mined narrow approaches. They used smoke to hide soldiers carrying 22-pound satchel charges. In some sectors, men got close enough to destroy flame tanks by hand. Mud and mechanical failure claimed even more vehicles. Okinawa spring rains turned roads and fields into traps. Tracks dug into soft clay. Engines overheated. Transmissions strained. A vehicle carrying hundreds of gallons of fuel had to climb ground that sometimes could barely support an ordinary tank. By late May, the battalion had lost many vehicles to enemy action, terrain, and breakdowns. Yet the cave problem remained. And when the Japanese withdrew from Shuri into the southern ridges, the flame tanks followed. The new line was worse than the old one. Yaeju-Dake rose as a jagged wall across the American advance. Hill 95 anchored the eastern side above steep drops. Yaeju-Dake and Kunishi Ridge strengthened the west. Between them lay coral outcroppings, wooded folds, narrow valleys, and caves that could cover one another. The official Army history called the battlefield perfect for armored flamethrowers. That phrase sounds like praise for the weapon. It was also an admission about the ground. The battlefield was perfect for flame because it was nearly impossible for everything else. On June 10, tanks began moving toward the escarpment in strength. Artillery struck the slopes. Naval guns worked the seaward face. Infantry tried to cross open ground under fire from positions hidden in the rock. At Hill 95, some cave mouths could not be reached by the tanks at all. The answer was almost unbelievable. A crew attached a long hose to a flame tank. Men dragged the hose up the near vertical coral face while tanks, machine guns, artillery, and mortars covered them. They climbed like figures pinned to a wall, carrying the reach of the tank where the tank itself could not go. Near the lip, they sprayed napalm across the rocks above them. Then infantry followed through the burned position and seized the edge. Elsewhere, flame tanks moved at the front of armored attacks, closing on cave clusters and firing short bursts across the openings. 1 second. Shift the barrel. 1 second. Shift again. The purpose was not to fill the entire cave with liquid fire. It was to make the entrance and the passage behind it uninhabitable. Burning gel adhered to the walls. Heat accumulated in confined spaces. Smoke and combustion gases moved through the tunnels. A network designed to let soldiers escape from one firing point to another could carry the effects of the attack deeper than the visible opening. The same tunnels that defeated artillery now linked each position to the danger entering the first cave. The defensive system began to betray itself. Men who stayed underground faced heat and smoke. Men who came out entered machine gun lanes covered by American infantry. Positions that went silent were not assumed dead. Demolition teams moved in with grenades and satchel charges to seal the openings. Gun tanks and artillery kept other caves suppressed while the infantry worked. That was the real weapon. Not flame alone. Not explosives alone. Not infantry alone. A sequence. Suppress the hillside. Drive the armored projector close enough. Force the position silent or empty. Cover the exits, seal the cave, move to the next opening. Blowtorch and corkscrew. From June 13 through June 17, the 713th burned through more than 37,000 gallons of fuel. Set that against a capacity of roughly 290 gallons per tank. It means the equivalent of more than 127 full tank loads in 5 days. It means vehicles firing until nearly dry, backing out through the combat zone, spending roughly an hour and a half at the fuel point, rebuilding pressure, and returning again. It means drivers, mechanics, chemical troops, fuel handlers, and tank crews running a continuous shuttle behind the assault. The number is not only a measure of destruction, it is a measure of tempo. The tanks did not arrive once and unleash a single spectacular attack. They went forward, emptied, withdrew, refilled, and went forward again until the cave system stopped functioning as a line. The Japanese understood the threat. Once a flame tank revealed itself, every weapon in range tried to kill it. Captured accounts treated the armored flamethrowers as one of the most destructive weapons used against the positions. Not because flame erased the need for infantry, but because it reached the one space artillery could not reliably enter. By June 12, American troops had forced lodgements on Hill 95 and along the Yaeju-Dake rim. From June 13 through June 17, the flame tanks helped tear through the coral positions beyond them. Hills 115 and 153 isolated strongpoints and the broken plateau leading toward Hill 89. That did not end the Battle of Okinawa. It broke the last organized barrier. Fighting continued toward Hill 89 and the last headquarters caves. Buckner was killed by Japanese fire on June 18. One day after the escarpment battle reached its turning point. On June 21, organized Japanese resistance collapsed as a coordinated system, although isolated fighting continued. Early on June 22, deep inside the headquarters complex below Hill 89, Ushijima and Cho took their own lives. The men who had designed the defense died beneath ground American troops now held above them. The island was declared secure days later. The campaign had lasted 82 days. The 713th's own wartime ledger credited the battalion with thousands of Japanese casualties across 85 days of combat. Those totals must be read carefully. They describe casualties attributed to the battalion's operations, not a precise count of men killed by flame alone. Every successful assault depended on infantry, artillery, demolition teams, gun tanks, engineers, and the supply system that kept the flame vehicles moving. The fuel total requires the same honesty. The battalion history recorded approximately 76,000 gallons used during the Okinawa campaign. More than 37,000 of those gallons were expended in the 5 heaviest days at the end. That proportion tells us where the weapon mattered most. Not on the beaches, not in a duel between tanks. At the final barrier where the enemy had built a defense specifically to survive American firepower, the flame tanks did not destroy Japan's last line by themselves. The 7th and 96th Infantry Divisions assaulted the ground. Riflemen climbed the slopes, demolition teams closed the caves. Artillery and naval gunfire suppressed what they could reach. Ordinary Shermans fired high explosive and machine guns into every visible position. All of it was necessary. The flame tank solved one narrow problem that none of the others could solve reliably. It made the interior of the fortress reachable. That is why the decision to remove the Sherman's cannon mattered. The Americans did not create a stronger tank. They created a specialized vehicle that was almost helpless outside its purpose, then drove it directly into the range where the enemy was best able to kill it. Its crews carried fuel instead of shells. They depended on infantry for protection. They depended on mechanics and chemical troops to return them to battle. And in the final 5 days at Yaeju-Dake, they used that fragile system to attack a stronger one. The Japanese line was built on a simple truth. Rock could absorb punishment that men could not. The flame tanks changed the equation. They did not have to break the rock. They only had to make the rock stop protecting the men inside it. For 80 days, the caves had turned the mountain into a weapon. In 5 days, the flame tanks made the mountain turn against its own defense. They did not win Okinawa alone. They did something narrower and decisive. They made the rock stop working.